Come closer to the hearth and let the warmth settle into your bones. The fire is low tonight, and the shadows in the corners of the room have grown long and heavy. We all know the story of the girl in the red cloak who walked through the woods to visit her grandmother. We remember the basket of treats and the wolf who waited in the bed with big eyes and big teeth. It is a story told to keep children tucked safely under their blankets. But there is an older version of this tale that the fireside forgot, a version where there is no brave woodcutter to swing his axe and no miraculous escape. In the oldest echoes of this story, the wolf does not just wait for the girl. He kills the grandmother first, and then he prepares a meal. He places the grandmother's flesh on a plate and her blood in a glass. When the girl arrives, the wolf invites her to eat and drink. She consumes her own kin without knowing it because she trusted the voice behind the door. This is where our journey begins tonight. We must understand why a story so cruel and so visceral was whispered in the dark for hundreds of years. This was not a bedtime story, but a map of survival. In the centuries before paved roads and streetlights, the forest was not a place of wonder, but a place of absolute finality. If you stepped off the path, you did not just get lost, you ceased to exist. The girl in the red cloak represents every individual who stands at the edge of the known world. Her red hood was not just a garment, but a target and a warning. It signaled her transition into the world of adults, where trust is a currency that can buy your life or sell it. We think of the wolf as a monster with fur and claws because that is easier for a child to process, but the original listeners knew the truth. The wolf was anyone who spoke with a silver tongue while hiding a hollow heart. The wolf was the neighbor who watched you leave. The wolf was the stranger who knew the shortcuts better than you did. As the wood pops and hisses in the great try to imagine the silence of a winter in the year 1700, there were no sirens and no authorities to call. There was only the sound of your own breathing and the knowledge that the person meeting you on the path might be your end. This story was a tool used to sharpen the instincts of the young before they were sent out into a world that did not care for their innocence. We are going to peel back the layers of this old myth to see the bones beneath. We will look at the hunger that drove people to do the unthinkable and the social rules that were carved into these tales to prevent the collapse of entire villages. The forest is still there even if we have replaced the trees with glass and steel. The predators have only changed their clothes. Lean back and listen as the embers glow. We are going to talk about the price of a wrong turn and the ancient reasons why every village warned its children never to speak to the shadows. The logs in the hearth settle with a soft crunch, and a flurry of sparks reminds us that everything eventually turns to ash. To understand why we tell the story of the girl and the wolf, we must travel back across the centuries to the deep valleys of the French countryside in 1600s. This was a world defined by the edge of the woods. In these oral traditions, the creature that meets the girl is often not a simple animal but a bzou. This is an old word for a werewolf or a man who has chosen to shed his humanity to hunt his own kind. When we look at the historical records of this era, we find that the werewolf was not a supernatural fantasy but a legal and social reality. There were trials, and there were executions for men accused of being wolves. This historical context reveals a terrifying truth that the original listeners understood perfectly. The monster in the story was a human predator who used the isolation of the forest to bypass the laws of the village. We are moving from the simple fear of claws to the complex fear of the neighbor who wears a mask of civility. This is the analysis of the predator as a social entity. In a world where a village might only consist of 20 families, everyone knew everyone else. To survive the winter, you had to trust your neighbor with your life and your grain. But the forest provided a theater where that trust could be violated without witnesses. The bzou, or the werewolf, was a manifestation of the person who breaks the social contract. When the wolf speaks to the girl on the path, he is testing her boundaries and he is gathering intelligence. He is checking to see if she is expected by someone and if anyone is watching the trail. This is a surgical dissection of how a predator operates in an environment of scarcity. In the 17th century, the French peasant lived on the knife edge of survival. A bad harvest meant that the weak were often viewed as a burden on the collective. The story of the girl being tricked into eating her grandmother is a reflection of the deep-seated cultural anxiety regarding cannibalism during the Great Famines. It was a warning that when the world turns cold and the belly is empty, even the people you love might become a source of sustenance for the desperate. This is why the original version of the story contains such graphic and unsettling details. It was designed to create a visceral reaction of disgust and horror. This disgust was a protective mechanism meant to reinforce the boundaries of what it means to be human. By identifying the wolf as a man who acts like a beast, the story provided a framework for identifying and ostracizing those who were a threat to the community. The wolf is the one who takes without giving, and the one who consumes without conscience. The historical reality of the wolf was often a man who had been cast out of society, or a soldier returning from the wars who had forgotten how to live among people. These were the men who haunted the fringes of the woods. They knew the girl would be walking to her grandmother's house because the routines of the poor were predictable and rigid. In our modern world, we have sanitized this history because we find it too dark to bear. We have turned the bzou into a cartoon with a nightcap. But for the person sitting by a fire like this 300 years ago, the danger was as real as the cold seeping through the door. They needed their children to understand that a smile can be a predatory display and that a helpful suggestion on a lonely road can be a trap. This chapter of the story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous thing in the forest was never the wolf. It was the man who decided that the rules of the village no longer applied to him. As the smoke rises, let that thought sit with you. The ancient fear was not about being eaten by an animal, but about being hunted by someone who knows your name. It was a lesson in the fragility of social trust and the terrible cost of being too kind to a stranger in a lawless place. Listen closely to the way the wind rattles the shutters tonight. It is a lonely sound, and it reminds us of the isolation that once defined every human life. We have discussed the predator and the historical darkness of the woods, but now we must look at the village itself and the invisible lines drawn around it. In our architecture of this story, we find ourselves in the third chapter, where we integrate the physical forest with the societal structures of the past. The forest was not merely a collection of trees and brush. It was a vacuum of authority. Within the walls of the village there was a priest and a mayor and a father and a mother. There were eyes at every window and ears pressed against every common wall. You were known, and because you were known, you were relatively safe. But the moment the girl stepped past the last tilled field and entered the shade of the oaks, she entered a place where the social contract had no weight. This integration of space and safety is the core of the ancient warning. We must understand that for a small community in the pre-industrial world, the forest was a boundary between the collective and the chaos. The rules of the village were designed to keep the group alive through shared labor and shared resources. When the girl in the red cloak meets the wolf, she is essentially being tested on whether she carries the village within her, or if she leaves it behind once she is out of sight. The wolf asks her where she is going, and she tells him the truth. This is the first failure of societal defense. She treats a stranger in the woods as if he were a neighbor in the town square. She applies the rules of a high-trust society to a low-trust environment, and that mistake is what invites the wolf into her family home. This connection between physical boundaries and social trust was the most important lesson a young person could learn. You were taught that the world is divided into two distinct zones. There is the zone of accountability where your actions have consequences and people are who they say they are. Then there is the zone of the wild where every interaction is a gamble with your life. The story functions as a map for navigating these two worlds. It tells the listener that the woods are a lawless space where the only protection you have is your own silence and your own speed. This societal layer of the story explains why the forest is always described as dark and impenetrable. It is not just about a lack of light, but a lack of transparency. You cannot see the intentions of those you meet among the trees. In the village, a person's reputation preceded them by 40 years. In the woods, a person is only what they claim to be in that moment. This is why the wolf can mimic a grandmother and why the girl is so easily deceived. She has lived her entire life in a place where people are who they appear to be. The integration of this fear into the story served to create a healthy paranoia that was essential for survival. If you were a child in a village of 300 people, you were part of a fragile system that could be broken by one malicious outsider. The forest was the gateway through which those outsiders came. By telling this story, the elders were installing a psychological fence around the children. They were teaching them that the transition from the village to the forest required a transition in the soul. You could not be the same person in the woods that you were at the hearth. You had to become guarded and you had to become suspicious. This was the non-negotiable rule of social trust. You do not grant it to anyone who exists outside the boundary of your known world. As the fire burns down and the room grows colder, think about the boundaries we still maintain today. We still have our villages and we still have our forests, even if they are made of digital signals or city streets. The ancient fear remains the same. It is the fear that we will forget the rules of the boundary and let the wolf follow us home because we were too polite to keep the door closed. This chapter reminds us that the forest is not just a place, but a state of being where the social safety nets of humanity are stripped away, and you are left with nothing but your own judgment. We are beginning to see the true shape of the map now. The forest is the test, and the village is the prize for those who pass it. In our next movement, we will look at the paths themselves and the impossible choices that determined whether a girl would become a woman or a memory. The fire burns with a steady white heat now, and the light it casts is sharp and unforgiving. We have explored the predator and the boundary, but now we must look at the mechanics of the journey itself. In the older oral versions of this tale, the wolf asks the girl a very specific question before they part ways at the fork in the road. He asks her if she will take the path of needles or the path of pins. This detail has been lost to the modern ear, but to a peasant in the 1700s, it was a question that defined the very structure of a human life. We are entering the systemic analysis of the story. We are looking at how human systems of labor and survival were encoded into this nightmare. The path of needles and the path of pins represented the two main occupations available to young women in the pre-industrial era. Working with needles meant the fine craft of sewing and tailoring. It was a domestic labor that kept a girl within the safety of the household or the workshop. Working with pins was the labor of the lace makers and the weavers. It was often a more public and mobile form of work. By asking this question, the wolf is not just playing a game. He is identifying the girl's social and economic standing. He is calculating her vulnerability within the systems of the village. In our modern world, we think of paths as simple choices between left and right, but in the 17th century, a path was a lifelong commitment to a specific role. The choice the girl makes tells the wolf everything he needs to know about who will miss her, and how long she has until she is expected home. This is the cold logic of the predator as a systemic analyst. He understands the schedule of the village. He knows the rhythms of the workday. This reveals a new layer of the cost of the forest. The forest was not just a place where you might be eaten, but a place where your economic and social value was assessed by those who wished to exploit it. The system of pins and needles was a way to categorize the labor of the young, and the wolf represents the breaking of that system. When the girl chooses her path, she is following the rules of her training, but she is doing so in a space where those rules no longer protect her. We must understand that the labor systems of the past were incredibly rigid. A person was often defined entirely by the tools they carried. The needles and pins were symbols of utility and order. By introducing these symbols into a story about a devouring monster, the elders were teaching their children that even your work and your duty can be used as a trail for a predator to follow. The wolf uses the girl's own destination and her own tasks against her. This is a surgical dissection of how systems of productivity create patterns of behavior that predators can exploit. The faster we move through the world, and the more predictable our routines become, the easier it is for the wolf to wait at the end of the road. Subject meets object, predator meets prey. The girl is walking toward a system of care and duty, while the wolf is operating within a system of consumption and opportunism. This systemic layer shows us that the story was a warning about the transparency of our lives. If you follow the path of needles, everyone knows where you are. If you follow the path of pins, everyone knows where you are going. The non-negotiable rule of the forest was that your routine is your greatest weakness. To survive the woods, you had to be able to step outside the system and become unpredictable. The girl fails because she is a perfect product of her society. She is helpful and she is diligent and she is on time. In the village, these are virtues. In the forest, these are the traits of a victim. As the sparks fly upward, think about the systems you inhabit and the paths you walk every day. We are all following trails of needles or pins, and we all believe that our busy work makes us safe. But the quiet archivist reminds you that the wolf is the only one who truly appreciates a predictable schedule. He is the master of the map, and he knows exactly where the paths of needles and pins converge. The revelation is that our very structures of order are what make the chaos of the woods so deadly. We have built a world of straight lines, and the wolf is the only creature who knows how to curve. Listen to the silence of the room. The system is only as strong as the person walking within it. In the next chapter, we will lower our heart rates and look at the physical reality of the cottage to find the grounding we need before we venture deeper into the dark. Let the tension drain from your shoulders as you sit by this dying fire. We have walked the dangerous paths of the woods and looked into the eyes of the wolf, but now we have arrived at the destination. Take a deep breath and smell the scent of dried herbs and the faint, sweet musk of old wood. We are at the grandmother's cottage. This is a moment of relief and a grounding of the soul. In the version of the story we carry in our hearts, the cottage is a place of ultimate safety. It is the end of the journey and the reward for the long walk. Close your eyes and imagine the small windows of hand-blown glass and the thatched roof that holds the warmth of a summer long since past. This is the personal layer of our story, where the world shrinks down to the size of a single room. For the people of the 17th century, the home of an elder was a sacred space. It was a repository of memory and a library of survival. Everything inside the cottage had a purpose. There were the heavy iron pots for the soup and the bundles of lavender hanging from the rafters to keep away the damp and the moths. The grandmother herself represents the bridge between the past and the future. She is the one who has seen 80 winters and knows the secret names of the roots that heal and the berries that kill. To reach her door is to reach the heart of the family line. This chapter is here to lower your heart rate and to remind you of what was at stake. We do not tell stories about the forest just to talk about monsters. We tell them to protect the sanctuary of the home. The relief we feel when the girl reaches the gate is a profound human emotion. It is the feeling of coming in from the cold and knowing that you are loved. But even here in this place of quiet and peace, there is a lingering shadow. The fire in the grandmother's hearth is low, just like ours, and the floorboards creak with a familiar rhythm. We feel grounded because we recognize this setting. We all have a version of this cottage in our minds. It is the place where the tea is always hot and the blankets are always heavy. This is why the violation that follows in the story is so deeply painful. The cottage is supposed to be the one place where the wolf cannot go. It is the fortress of the family. By spending a moment here in the stillness, we are reminded of the beauty of the things we are trying to protect. We are reminded that the girl was not just walking through the woods for an adventure, she was carrying a link in a chain. She was bringing food to the person who held the history of her people. When we talk about the personal cost of the forest, we are talking about the loss of this connection. We are talking about the silence that falls when the grandmother's voice is silenced. Feel the warmth of the fire on your face and listen to the rhythmic ticking of a clock that measures out the lives of the villagers. There is a great comfort in the domestic and the small, the smell of baking bread and the soft texture of a hand-stitched quilt. These are the things that make a human life worth living. They are the reasons why the rules of the forest were non-negotiable. You followed the rules so that you could return to this room. You stayed on the path so that the fire in this hearth would never go out. This moment of relief is necessary because it restores our perspective. It reminds us that the struggle against the dark is not about hatred for the wolf, but about love for the grandmother. As the embers pulse with a soft orange light, let yourself feel the weight of the years. We are resting now so that we can be strong for what comes next. The cottage is a sanctuary of trust, and in the chapters to come, we will examine why that trust was the most fragile thing in the world. The peace of the cottage is a fragile thing, and as we sit here by the embers, we must acknowledge that the walls are only as strong as the people who defend them. We are moving now into a deeper dissection of the village mind. This is the analysis of our societal structures and the concept of stranger danger as a survival imperative. In the small isolated communities of the past, there was no greater threat than a single bad actor. We often think of society as a large and robust machine, but 300 years ago, a village was a delicate organism. If one person stole the seed grain, or if one person brought a sickness from the outside, or if one person betrayed the location of the livestock to bandits, the entire community could perish before the spring thaw. This is why the rules regarding strangers were so absolute and so harsh. The story of the girl and the wolf is a core logic mechanism for maintaining the integrity of the tribe. It encoded a specific type of social suspicion that was necessary when there were no police and no courts to appeal to. When the girl meets the wolf, she is not just being foolish, she is committing a crime against her community. She is leaking information. She tells the outsider where the vulnerable reside and how to gain entrance to their homes. In a societal sense, the girl is the weak point in the village walls. This analysis reveals that the moral of the story was not just about personal safety, but about the collective security of everyone you love. The wolf represents the stranger who seeks to exploit the resource pool of the village without contributing to it. In the 17th century, a stranger was often viewed as a parasite until they proved otherwise. This sounds cruel to our modern ears because we live in a world of global travel and digital connections. We are taught to be welcoming and inclusive. But in the year 1650, being inclusive to the wrong person meant your children would starve. The mechanism of the story functions by creating a profound sense of unease around anyone who does not belong to the local geography. It teaches the listener that the woods are populated by those who have no stake in your survival. The wolf can afford to be charming, and he can afford to be helpful because he is not bound by the long-term consequences of his actions. He will eat and he will move on while the village is left to bury its dead. This is the logic of the predator. He operates on a timeline of minutes, while the society operates on a timeline of generations. By teaching children to fear the wolf, the village was actually teaching them to value the social contract of their own people. The wolf is the ultimate individualist, and individualism was a luxury that pre-industrial villages could not afford. You were either part of the we, or you were a threat. The revelation here is that the monsters in our stories are often just reflections of our own social anxieties. We needed the wolf to be terrifying so that the children would stay within the circle of the fire. We needed the wolf to be deceptive so that the children would understand that a person is not always what they say they are. This is the societal layer of the cautionary tale. It is the architectural blueprint for a high-trust society that can only exist by being ruthlessly exclusive to the outside. The cost of this safety was a permanent state of alertness. You could never truly relax because the forest was always there, and the forest was always full of people who did not know your name. As you listen to the wood pop and crackle, think about the ways we still define our own circles. We still have our gates and our passwords and our ways of checking who belongs. The ancient fear has not vanished, it has only become more subtle. The story reminds us that the primary duty of the individual is to protect the integrity of the group. If you speak to the wolf, you are not just risking your own life, you are handing him the keys to the grandmother's house. The moral is a warning about the weight of your words and the high price of misplaced trust. We are beginning to see why these rules were non-negotiable. They were the only things standing between the village and the void. Stay with me as the fire sinks lower, and we look at how these societal fears were written into the very history of our civilization. The shadows are lengthening now, and as the fire settles, we must confront the cold reality of the past. In our 7th chapter, we integrate the wolf's deception with the actual history of the European landscape. We are moving quickly now. Subject meets history. The forest was not just a symbol, it was a place of high stakes and short lives. Between the years 1400 and 1800, Europe was often a theater of endless war and recurring famine. When a soldier was discharged from an army or a peasant was driven from their land by hunger, they did not go to a city for help. They went to the woods. These were the masterless men. They were the original wolves of the story. They were individuals who had been stripped of their social identity and their place at the hearth. To survive, they had to become experts in the terrain of the forest and the psychology of the villagers. They knew that a small girl carrying a basket was not just a meal, but a key to a greater store of resources. We must connect the dots between the wolf's polite inquiry on the path and the tactical reconnaissance of a bandit. When the wolf asks the girl about the grandmother's house, he is performing a risk assessment. He is checking to see if there are dogs. He is checking to see if the door is barred. He is checking to see if there is a man with a musket or an axe waiting inside. The history of the woods is a history of these quiet evaluations. In times of extreme scarcity like the 17th century, the difference between life and death was often the ability to deceive. This integration of history and myth shows us that the story of Little Red Riding Hood was a survival manual for an era of wandering predators. The wolf is the bandit who uses the cover of the trees to mask his approach. He is the outlaw who has learned to mimic the speech and the manners of the people he intends to rob. This is why the girl's conversation with the wolf is the most dangerous part of the tale. She is not just talking to an animal. She is giving a map to a mercenary We must understand that in the historical record, the woods were seen as a place where the king's law stopped. If something happened to you under the canopy of the oaks, there was no way to track the perpetrator. There was no forensic evidence and no pursuit. The perpetrator simply vanished back into the green. This created a profound sense of vulnerability for anyone who had to travel between settlements. The story was told to ensure that every child understood the high concept of tactical silence. You do not disclose your destination. You do not disclose your cargo. You do not disclose your family's weaknesses to anyone who exists outside the village wall. The revelation here is that the wolf's deception is a direct reflection of human cunning in a world of limited resources. The bandits of the forest were often people who had once been neighbors. They knew the customs, they knew the traditions. They knew exactly which lies would sound like the truth. This is the historical weight of the story. It is a record of the era when the forest was a repository for the desperate and the dangerous. By merging the myth with the history, we see that the monster is a placeholder for the very real threat of the desperate human. The forest was a boundary between the law of the village and the law of the knife. As the fire crackles, think about how we still fear the places where the light of civilization does not reach. We still worry about the dark alley and the lonely road. We still teach our children to be careful with their information. The ancient fear has been validated by every century of our existence. The story reminds us that the world is full of those who have lost their place and who must hunt to find a new one. The wolf is not just coming for the grandmother, he is coming for the stability of the entire system. We have integrated the myth with the reality, and the picture that emerges is one of constant vigilance. The rules were non-negotiable because the history was unforgiving. The light of our fire is turning from a dance to a steady pulse, and we must now look at the garment that gives this story its name. We are entering a systemic analysis of the girl herself and the red cloak that marks her as a target in the eyes of the world. In the older oral versions, the color red was not just a charming detail chosen for a child, it was a symbol of immense systemic weight. We must understand that in the pre-industrial era, dyeing fabric red was an expensive and laborious process. It often involved the use of crushed insects or rare minerals. To dress a child in red was to make a statement about value and about maturity. On a systemic level, the red cloak represents the onset of fertility and the biological transition from a child to a young woman. The color of blood is the color of the life cycle, and in the 17th century, this transition was the moment a girl became a valuable asset to her family and a primary target for the predatory systems of the world. The wolf is not just hunting for meat, he is hunting for the future. He is hunting for the biological potential that the girl represents. This analysis reveals a cold and precise layer of our social history. A young woman was a vessel for the continuation of the family line and the stability of the village economy. When she steps into the forest wearing the color of her own blooming maturity, she is signaling to every predator that she is now a prize worth taking. The systemic rules of the past were designed to protect this value by keeping it under lock and key, but the forest is a place where those locks do not exist. The red cloak acts as a beacon that draws the gaze of the masterless men and the outlaws we discussed earlier. They do not see a child, they see a dowry. They see a connection to a household, they see a biological opportunity. This is why the warning was so non-negotiable. The elders were not just concerned about the girl's life, but about the survival of the system she was a part of. If a young woman was lost to the woods, it was a systemic failure for the entire community. It was a loss of labor and a loss of potential and a loss of the thread that connects the generations. The wolf understands this perfectly. He is a systemic disruptor. By consuming the girl, he is not just feeding himself, but he is severing a branch of the village tree. We must look at the red cloak as a uniform of vulnerability. In our modern world, we think of fashion as a choice, but in the past your clothes were a declaration of your status and your risks. The red hood was a target painted on the back of the innocent. It said to the world that this person is now entering the age of consequences. The wolf's fascination with the girl is a reflection of the systemic pressure on young women to be both productive and protected. The forest is the place where those two things are in constant conflict. You must go to the grandmother to fulfill your duty, but by doing so you must expose yourself to the gaze of the wolf. This is the surgical truth of the story. The very things that make the girl valuable to her society are the things that make her a victim in the wild. The systemic layer of the red cloak teaches us that we are never just individuals. We are always carrying the symbols of our people and our place in the world. When you walk through the shadows, you are carrying everything your village has invested in you. The wolf is waiting for the moment you forget that your red cloak is not just a coat, but a responsibility. As the embers glow, consider the ways we still mark ourselves today. We still use symbols to show our status and our maturity, and we still wonder why those symbols draw the wrong kind of attention. The ancient fear remains rooted in the reality that to be seen is to be hunted. The story is a map of that visibility. It tells us that the more we have to offer, the more we must fear the silence of the woods. Stay with me as we move from the systems of the village back into the deep and personal silence of the forest, where even the red cloak cannot save you from the hunger of the dark. Take a moment to sit in the stillness and let the heat of the fire settle against your skin. We have analyzed the cloak and the paths and the predators, but now we must return to the absolute silence of the deep woods. In this 9th chapter, we seek relief and grounding in the sensory reality of the forest itself. Imagine the world as it was before the roar of engines and the hum of electricity. When the girl in the red cloak walked under the canopy, she was entering a cathedral of wood and shadows where the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. This is the personal layer of the journey where the scale of the world becomes overwhelming. For a child, the trees are not just plants, but towering giants that block out the sun and turn the afternoon into a premature twilight. Listen to the sound of your own footsteps on the dry needles and the way the world holds its breath when you stop moving. There is a specific kind of quiet that exists only in the heart of a great forest in winter. It is a silence that feels heavy and thick, like a physical weight pressing against your chest. This sensory experience was the reality for every person who traveled between villages. They were immersed in a landscape that was indifferent to their survival. You can feel the rough texture of the bark and the bite of the frost on your fingertips as you reach out to steady yourself. This moment of grounding is necessary because it reminds us of our own smallness. We are fragile creatures of flesh and bone, and the forest is a vast and ancient system that has seen countless generations come and go. The snapping of a single twig in this silence sounds like a gunshot, and it sends a jolt of electricity through the heart. This is the physiological alertness that kept our ancestors alive. They did not just think about danger, they felt it in the tightening of their skin and the heightening of their hearing. By lingering here in the sensory details, we can understand why the story of the wolf was so effective. It was not just a narrative, but a way of tuning the senses. The forest was a place of hyper-awareness. Every rustle in the undergrowth and every shifting shadow had to be interpreted. Was it the wind, or was it something with intent? The smell of wood smoke from a distant chimney was a lifeline, and the sudden absence of birdsong was a warning. We find relief in this chapter, not because the woods are safe, but because they are real. They ground us in the physical world and peel away the distractions of our modern lives. we are reminded that the first rule of the forest was to be present. You could not afford to daydream or to wander aimlessly. Your mind had to be as sharp as the cold air. The beauty of the moss-covered stones and the intricate patterns of the bare branches against the grey sky provided a brief respite from the fear. There is a profound peace in the natural world, even when that world is dangerous. It is a peace of absolute clarity. When you are in the woods, you know exactly what matters. You matter, your next step matters, the warmth of the cottage at the end of the road matters. This personal grounding allows us to reconnect with the primal instincts that the story of the girl and the wolf was designed to protect. We are training our hearts to recognize the true scale of the world. The fire in our hearth is small and the forest is very large. But as long as we remain aware, and as long as we listen to the silence, we are participating in the ancient dance of survival. Breathe in the cold air and feel the stillness of the room. The logs are turning to glowing coals, and the light is soft and amber. We are resting here in the heart of the woods so that we can face the darker truths that wait in the next chapter. The silence is not our enemy. It is our teacher. Listen to the settling of the house and the slow pulse of the fire. You are here and you are aware, and for this moment that is enough. In a while we will talk about what happens when that silence is broken by a voice that sounds almost like someone you know. The logs have shifted in the grate, and the new light reveals the skeletons of the wood beneath the flame. We must now integrate our understanding with one of the most harrowing aspects of the original peasant tales. We are looking at the societal layer and the grim reality of famine during the period known as the Little Ice Age. To integrate these dots, we must go back to the wolf and the grandmother's cottage. In the oldest oral traditions, the wolf does not just eat the grandmother. He sets the table. He saves a portion of her body and pours a glass of her blood. When the girl arrives, he encourages her to sit and feast on what he has prepared. The girl eats. She consumes her own ancestor. This detail is often stripped away because it is too much for our modern sensibilities to hold, but it was essential for the survival of the village. This integration of cannibalism into the myth was a reflection of the recurring famines that gripped Europe between the years 1300 and 1700. During these times, the social order did not just bend, it shattered. There are historical accounts of parents forced to choose which child would eat and which would starve, and of communities driven to the absolute brink of human morality. The story of the girl eating her grandmother was a coded warning about the total collapse of the social contract. It was a way of saying that when the food runs out, the person next to you is no longer a neighbor but a resource. By telling this to children, the elders were reinforcing the non-negotiable nature of communal sharing. They were showing that once you cross the line into the consumption of your own kind, you have become the wolf. The wolf is not just an outsider. The wolf is anyone who prioritizes their own hunger over the survival of the family lineage. This societal analysis shows us that the story served as a psychological barrier against the unthinkable. It created a deep and lasting taboo that was necessary to keep the village together during the leanest years. The girl's unintentional act of cannibalism is the ultimate tragedy because it represents the loss of her soul and the end of her connection to the past. She has literally consumed the source of her own history. This integration of the myth with the history of starvation helps us understand why the rules of the forest were so rigid. If you lost your way in the woods during a famine, you were not just in danger of being eaten by an animal. You were in danger of encountering a human who had lost their humanity. The forest was the place where the hunger was strongest and the social rules were weakest. The story was a reminder that you must never accept a meal from a stranger, and you must never trust a table that has been set in the dark. It was a lesson in the high cost of ignorance. In the year 1693, France lost 10% of its population to famine. This is not a distant number. This is a story of empty bowls and cold hearths. The girl in the red cloak was walking through a world that was literally starving to death. The wolf's invitation to eat was the most tempting and the most deadly trap he could set. By integrating this historical weight, we see the true shape of the forest. It was a landscape of desperation where the boundaries of the self were constantly under threat. The moral is clear. Your hunger must never lead you to betray your blood. You must stay alert to the reality of the situation, even when your stomach is empty. The ancient fear was that the famine would turn us all into monsters. As the fire burns down, think about the security we take for granted today. We do not fear the empty cupboard as our ancestors did, but the story remains as a testament to the resilience and the terror of those who came before us. They told this story so that their children would remember that being human is a choice we must make every day, even when the woods are silent and the winter is long. We have integrated the history of the hunger, and now we must move to the systemic evolution of the tale, where the story was changed by those who wanted to control the village from a distance. The fire is low, but the light is enough to see the path ahead. The embers are glowing with a deep intensity now, and we must watch as the story itself begins to change shape under the pressure of the powerful. In this 11th chapter, we enter a systemic analysis of how the narrative evolved from a peasant survival manual into a tool of state control. We must look at the transition from the raw oral tales of the French countryside to the polished literary versions of Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. In the original tales, the girl was often clever enough to escape by her own wits, or she perished in a brutal lesson about the reality of nature. But as the centuries moved forward, the state and the church began to take an interest in the behavior of the masses. They saw the story of the girl and the wolf not as a map of physical predators, but as a vehicle for moral instruction. This is the systemic layer where the forest becomes a metaphor for sin, and the wolf becomes a metaphor for the lack of discipline. Charles Perrault, writing for the royal court of France in the late 1600s, was the first to give the girl her red hood. He took a story of survival and turned it into a warning about vanity and the danger of listening to flatterers. He stripped away the girl's agency and ended the story with her being devoured. He even added a poem to ensure the moral was impossible to miss. This was a systemic shift. The story was no longer about teaching a child how to identify a bandit in the woods. It was about teaching a young woman how to behave in polite society. The wolf was transformed from a physical threat into a moral one. This analysis reveals how those in power use our ancient fears to enforce social order. By the time the Brothers Grimm collected the story in the 1800s, the system had shifted again. They added the figure of the huntsman. This is a crucial systemic intervention. In the older versions, there was no one coming to save you. You either stayed on the path or you were lost. But the 19th century wanted a story where authority was the ultimate protector. The huntsman represents the state and the law and the police. He is the external force that steps in to restore order when the individual fails. This change created a new psychological reality. It taught people that they were vulnerable and that they needed the protection of the system to survive the dark. It moved the responsibility for safety from the village and the individual to the institution. This systemic evolution shows us how the story was used to domesticate the wild. The forest was no longer a place of absolute finality, but a place that could be policed and managed. The non-negotiable rules of the past were replaced with the negotiable rules of the present. If you are a good girl, the huntsman will save you. If you follow the laws of the king, the wolf cannot hurt you. This was a lie told to maintain the stability of the growing nation-states. It obscured the original truth that the woods are indifferent to your morality. The wolf does not care if you are a sinner or a saint. He only cares if you are alone and if you are quiet. The systemic layer teaches us to look at who is telling the story and why. When the story is told by the village, it is about survival. When it is told by the state, it is about obedience. The red cloak became a uniform of the state's expectations. We have moved from a fast-paced world of sudden violence to a slow and measured world of systemic control. The cost of this shift was the loss of our primal instincts. We started to believe that the world was safer than it actually was because we thought the huntsman was always just around the corner. But as the fire burns low, we must remember that the huntsman is not always there, and the wolf has never left the woods. He has only learned to wait for the huntsman to fall asleep. Think about the stories we tell today and who they serve. We still have our huntsmen, and we still have our red cloaks. The ancient fear has been captured and put to work by the systems we live in. We are being told that we are safe as long as we belong to the system. But the quiet archivist knows that the system is just another kind of forest, and the rules of the wild still apply beneath the surface. Stay with me as we move back to the personal scale to see how this internal struggle defines our own psychology. The fire has burned down to a deep and steady crimson, and the room is filled with the soft scent of charred oak. We must now turn our gaze inward to the most intimate part of this architecture. In this 12th chapter, we seek to integrate the entire journey into the landscape of the individual human mind. We are looking at the personal layer of our existence, where the wolf is no longer a creature in the woods, but a part of our own psychology. Throughout this series, we have seen the girl in the red cloak walk through history and society and systems. But the final integration happens within the soul of the listener. We must understand that the ancient fear was not just about external threats, but about the internal loss of skepticism. To survive the forest, you had to carry an awareness of the wolf within yourself. This is the integration of the internalized predator. In the oldest and most brutal versions of the story, there is a moment where the girl realizes that she has been tricked. She looks into the eyes of the creature in the bed, and she sees the truth. This is the moment of revelation that every one of us must eventually face. It is the realization that the world is not always as it appears, and that trust is a choice rather than a default. By connecting these dots, we can see that the story was a tool for building psychological resilience. It taught the child that they possessed a survival instinct that was separate from the rules of their parents or their village. This personal integration served to create a healthy skepticism toward the pleasant and the easy. When the wolf speaks with the voice of the grandmother, he is exploiting the girl's desire for comfort and familiarity. The story warns us that our own emotions can be the very things that lead us into the trap. This is the high cost of ignorance in a world that does not offer second chances. By analyzing the story at this personal scale, we see that the forest is a metaphor for the transition into a mature consciousness. You enter the woods as a child who believes that everyone on the path is a friend. You exit the woods, or you fail to exit, as someone who understands the weight of boundaries. This integration of the wolf into our understanding of the world is what allows us to navigate the complexities of adulthood. We learn that we must be the protectors of our own innocence. The girl's failure was not that she was small or that she was weak. Her failure was that she did not listen to the quiet voice of her own suspicion. She ignored the way the air felt cold around the wolf and the way his eyes did not match his words. This psychological layer is why the story has endured for so many centuries. It resonates with our own internal struggle between the desire to trust and the necessity of being guarded. We find ourselves in the girl's shoes every time we encounter a situation where the truth is hidden behind a mask. The revelation here is that the wolf is the teacher of the most difficult lesson we will ever learn. He teaches us that safety is an illusion we create to keep the dark at bay. True safety only comes from the constant and vigilant awareness of our surroundings and our own vulnerabilities. As you sit by these dying embers, think about the wolves you have encountered in your own life and the times you chose to stay on the path or wander off. The story is a mirror. It shows us that the monsters in our myths are just manifestations of the real dangers we face within our own choices. This integration of the personal cost reminds us that we are the final defense against the forest. No huntsman can truly save a person who refuses to see the wolf standing right in front of them. We have looked at the systems and the history and the societies, but now we are left with the individual sitting by the fire. You are the architect of your own survival. The rules of the forest remain non-negotiable because the consequences of ignoring them are personal and they are permanent. Stay with the quiet of the room as we move toward the reflection of the countless others who have sat exactly where you are sitting now. Stay here with me for a moment longer as the fire begins its slow surrender to the ash. We have dissected the logic and the systems, but now we must simply sit with the memory of those who came before. This is a chapter of relief and historical reflection. We are grounding ourselves in the long line of human presence that stretches back through the dark. Imagine the thousands of small fires that have flickered in thousands of small cottages across the centuries. In every one of those rooms, someone sat exactly where you are sitting, and someone spoke the words of the girl and the wolf. This is the historical layer of our shared existence, where we honor the reality of the people who lived these stories. They were not characters in a book. They were mothers who felt the chill of the wind and fathers who sharpened their axes against the whetstone. They were children who looked at the edge of the forest and felt a genuine pull of terror and curiosity. By reflecting on this history, we find a profound kind of grounding. We are not alone in our fears. We are part of a continuous chain of survival. The story of Little Red Riding Hood survived because it worked. It kept enough children on the path and enough grandmothers safe behind their doors to allow the next generation to be born. When we look at the historical scale of this narrative, we see it as a monument to human resilience. These people lived through plagues and through 60-year wars, and through winters so cold that the birds froze in the trees. They did not have the luxuries of certainty or safety that we claim today. They only had their stories and their rules. We find relief in this because it reminds us of the strength we have inherited. The very fact that you are here to listen to this voice means that your ancestors knew how to identify the wolf. They knew when to speak and they knew when to remain silent. They passed the map down to you through the medium of the fairy tale. This is the weight of the centuries. It is a gentle authority that tells us we are built to survive the woods. The air in the room is heavy with the scent of the dying fire, and the world outside is vast and silent. But inside the circle of this story, there is a community of voices that whispers to us across the ages. They are telling us that the forest is manageable if you respect its boundaries. They are telling us that the rules were non-negotiable because life was precious and hard-won. We ground ourselves in the image of a small village huddling together against the winter. We see the glow of the windows and the smoke rising from the chimneys. This was the fortress of humanity. It was small and it was fragile, but it held. It held because of the stories. It held because every child knew that the wolf was real and the path was life. By honoring this history, we find the peace that comes from understanding our place in the world. We are the keepers of the archives. We are the ones who remember the warnings. The relief we feel is the relief of knowing our origins. We are the descendants of the ones who stayed on the path. As the embers pulse like a fading heartbeat, let yourself feel connected to that long history. You are carrying the red cloak now, and you are the one who decides what to tell the next generation. The ancient fears are not a burden, but a gift of clarity. They tell us what is worth protecting and they tell us that we have the power to do it. Listen to the soft hiss of the wood and the way the room seems to settle into the earth. We are resting in the memory of the millions who walked before us so that we can have the strength to finish our own journey. The history of the forest is the history of our courage. Stay in this peace for a while longer. The night is far from over, but we are not afraid of the dark. The fire has burned down to a skeletal glow, and the air in this room is thin and sharp. We must now turn our attention to the final deception of this narrative. In this 14th chapter, we perform a systemic analysis of the happy ending. We are looking at the abstract systems of narrative comfort that were created to mask the brutal truth of the human condition. In the version of the story you likely grew up with, there is a moment of impossible salvation. The wolf is cut open, and the grandmother and the child step out into the light perfectly whole and untouched by the teeth. This is a systemic lie. It is a structural fabrication designed to ease the transition into a modern world where we believe that every tragedy can be undone by an external authority. When we look at this through a systemic lens, we see the introduction of a dangerous kind of optimism. The original peasant stories were not interested in providing comfort, they were interested in providing truth. In the year 1700, the truth was that the wolf did not let you go. The truth was that once you were consumed, you were part of the darkness forever. This systemic shift toward the happy ending reveals how our institutions began to prioritize psychological comfort over practical survival. By providing a huntsman who can reverse death itself, the system taught us to lower our guard. It suggested that there is always a second chance, and that someone is always coming to rescue us. This analysis shows that the happy ending is actually a mechanism of vulnerability. It creates a world where the non-negotiable rules of the forest are treated as suggestions rather than laws. If you believe the huntsman is coming, you will walk a little closer to the shadows. If you believe death is reversible, you will talk to the stranger on the path. This systemic evolution represents the domestication of the human instinct. We have traded our sharpness for a sense of security that is only as strong as the system that provides it. The huntsman is a symbol of the state, and when the state fails, or when the state is slow, the old rules of the woods return with a vengeance. We must understand that the forest has not changed. The laws of nature and the mechanics of predation have not been altered by our stories. The only thing that has changed is our willingness to see the danger. This is a surgical dissection of the cost of our modern myths. By sanitizing the end of the story, we have obscured the very warnings that were meant to keep us alive. The systemic layer of the huntsman and the rescue is a veil thrown over the gaping mouth of the wolf. It tells us that we are safe in a world that remains fundamentally wild. This is why the quiet archivist must remind you of the original ending. In the dark of the 17th century, the girl died, the grandmother died, the village mourned, and the next child was told the story so that they might live. There was no magic and there was no miraculous recovery. There was only the consequence of a choice. This is the core logic of survival. Decisions are final. Trust is a risk. The forest is absolute. By removing the finality of the story, we have removed the weight of the moral. We have turned a map into a nursery rhyme. This systemic change reflects a broader societal desire to hide the harsh edges of reality from our view. We want a world without teeth. We want a world where the paths are always lit and the doors are never locked. But the ancient fear knows that this is an illusion. The happy ending is a sedative that makes us forget the hunger of the masterless men and the tactical silence of the woods. As the fire fades into grey ash, think about the rescues you are waiting for in your own life. Think about the systems you trust to keep the shadows at bay. The revelation is that there is no huntsman. There is only you and the path and the choices you make before the sun goes down. The systemic layer teaches us that true authority resides in our own vigilance. We must be our own woodcutters. We must be our own shield. The non-negotiable rules were designed for a world where no one was coming to help. When we embrace that reality, we find a different kind of strength. We find the strength of the one who knows the wolf is real and walks with their eyes wide open. The room is growing dark now, and the warmth is leaving the air. We have stripped away the last of the lies. In our final movement, we will stand at the boundary one last time to say goodbye to the fire and hello to the night. The fire has finally whispered its last, and the room is now held in the soft embrace of the blue hour. We have reached the final chapter of our long walk through the trees. Here we find ourselves at the point of integration, where the societal rules of the village meet the silence of the night. This story was never about a girl and a wolf. It was about the line between the known and the unknown. We must understand that the forest in our minds is just as real as the forest that once surrounded the ancient villages. It is a state of being where we are tested and where our social trust is weighed. Throughout our analysis, we have seen how the rules were non-negotiable because they were the only things that kept the vacuum of the wild from rushing in. The societal layer of this final integration is the realization that a civilization is only a collection of shared stories and mutual boundaries. If we stop telling the story, we lose the map. If we lose the map, we lose the village. This is why the archivist remains by the hearth even when the wood is gone, to keep the memory of the boundary alive. We must integrate the truth that the monsters are not gone. They have simply evolved with our social structures. They are the ones who exploit the gaps in our trust and the ones who use our own kindness against us. The lesson of the woods is that trust must be earned and boundaries must be defended. This is the core logic of human survival. As we move away from the abstract and the historical, let us zoom in on a single microscopic anchor to hold us to the earth. Think of the grandmother's door. Not the whole cottage, but just the iron latch. It is cold to the touch, and it carries the faint smell of oil and old metal. When the girl in the red cloak reached for that latch, she was at the final threshold of her life. That small piece of iron was the only thing standing between the girl and the truth. It is a heavy and simple object forged in a village fire. It represents the limit of our protection. A latch can be lifted from the outside if you have the right voice, or it can be barred from the inside if you have the right wisdom. In the end, we are all just hands reaching for a latch in the dark. We are all trying to get home before the light fails. The story is the iron. It is cold and it is hard and it does not care about our feelings, but it is the only thing that works. We have integrated the history and the systems and the personal costs into this one tiny detail. The weight of the latch is the weight of our responsibility to ourselves and to each other. As you go out into your own night, remember the smell of the smoke and the sound of the snapping twigs. Remember that the red cloak is a choice you make and the path is a promise you keep. The village is waiting for you and the grandmother is watching the road. Stay alert and stay on the path, and never forget the lesson of the iron latch. The fire is out now, but the warmth remains in your mind. I will be here when the next winter comes to remind you of the things we must never forget. Go softly into the night and keep your eyes on the edges of the woods. The story is finished, but the forest is forever.